The monitor pulsed with an unnatural heat signature. Specialist Kira Thorne saw it, a glint of movement on the ridge. "It's an ambush, sir!" But her warning was met with scorn. Would you have dared to defy a direct order when 30 lives hung in the balance? The monitor pulsed with an unnatural heat signature, a cluster of pixels on a jagged ridgeline. Specialist Kira Thorne saw it, a microscopic stutter in the landscape. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the contrast on the grainy thermal feed. "Sir, the thermal signature is too consistent for a cooking fire," Thorne whispered, her voice barely rising above the low, constant hum of massive server racks. "The heat dispersal pattern suggests multiple bodies in a fixed tactical position." A sharp, barking laugh cut through the tension, echoing from the center of the Crucible Command Center. Commander Rourke, the lead analyst, leaned back in his swivel chair, a smirk playing on his weathered face. He waved a dismissive hand towards the door. "It's just heat bloom from a goat herder's fire, Thorne," Rourke sneered, his eyes never leaving his own screen. "Go get yourself more coffee and sit down before you trip over your own boots and break something expensive." Kira felt the suffocating weight of 20 pairs of eyes, some mocking, some merely exhausted, pressing down on her shoulders. At 23, she was a rookie, a desk jockey in a den of veterans who believed experience was measured only in gray hair and cynicism. The air inside the Crucible was a thick, recycled soup of stale ozone and the bitter scent of over-roasted espresso. Fluorescent lights flickered against the bank of monitors, casting a sickly pale glow over faces etched with too many desert sunsets viewed through a digital lens. Kira Thorne did not belong here, at least not according to the unwritten rules of the command center. Her face still held a softness that the harsh desert winds hadn't yet scoured away, while the men around her boasted of tours in Helmand and other forgotten battlefields. To these grizzled veterans, her world of imagery intelligence was a secondary guess, a collection of pixels that lacked the undeniable proof of an intercepted voice. They called her the Librarian, a nickname meant to highlight her quiet nature and her obsession with data over intuition. But Kira's intuition was her data, sharpened by a relentless personal mission. Every morning, she meticulously cleaned her dual monitors, needing a flawless portal into the world thousands of feet below her drone's belly. She hunted shadows, looking for the things that weren't there. The absence of a familiar rock, the slight discoloration of sand. Her obsession with patterns wasn't just a career, it was a ghost she carried. Her older brother Liam, a combat medic, had been lost to an IED everyone had simply missed. Liam's death, described in the official report as a hidden threat in a routine environment, drove her. She had joined not to carry a pack, but to be the eyes her brother never had. The loneliness of the Crucible was a physical ache. She sat, surrounded by the hum of technology and the camaraderie of men forged in shared danger, yet she was entirely alone. The intercept team relied on what they could hear, trusting the spoken word of an enemy they thought they understood. Kira, however, trusted the silent testimony of the Earth itself. Men could lie on a radio, but the way a shadow fell across a ravine was a truth that couldn't be faked. Her steely resolve lived in the set of her jaw and the stillness of her hands. She knew her brother's life might have been saved if someone had noticed a 3-pixel shift. She lived inside the feed, memorizing the curves of the valleys and the heat signatures of the local wildlife. She knew the difference between the heat of a sun-baked boulder and the lingering warmth of a human body. As the mission clock ticked forward, Kira remained in her self-imposed bubble of concentration. She didn't join the banter. She didn't react to the subtle jabs about her goat herders' fires. She simply watched, her eyes reflecting the flickering blue light of the thermal feed. She was waiting for the one detail that didn't belong, The one break in the pattern that would prove her right. In her mind, the desert was a vast puzzle, and she was the only one in the room who realized a piece was missing. She just had to find it before the silence was broken by the sound of an explosion. Imagine being in her boots. Your expertise, your conviction, dismissed by seasoned professionals whose respect you desperately need. Would you have stayed quiet, saved your career, or would you have risked everything to stand your ground, knowing a single insubordinate outburst could lead to a permanent black mark on your record, all for lives you've never met? For Kira, the choice wasn't about ego. It was about a folded flag and the memory of taps playing over a grave that should have been empty for another 50 years. The digital clock on the wall glowed in harsh red numbers, marking the seconds. Call sign Spectre 7, a string of 5 white-hot rectangles, began its slow, deliberate crawl into the heart of the Serpent's Coil Canyon, a geological scar whose mineral-rich walls often played havoc with long-range radio transmissions. It was a place where silence wasn't just an absence of noise, it was a tactical reality. As the lead vehicle broke the shadow of the canyon entrance, Kira's eyes narrowed, her pupils darting across the thermal gradients of the eastern ridge. The convoy was banking on the all-clear provided by the very center she now stood in. Unaware of the silent, invisible threat Kira alone perceived, Spectre 7 continued its slow crawl into the canyon's jaws. As Spectre 7 edged deeper into the Serpent's coil, Kira's eyes narrowed, her pupils darting across the thermal gradients of the eastern ridge. There it was, a microscopic stutter in the landscape. To any other observer, it might have been a glitch, a momentary lag in the satellite uplink. But Kira's brain, trained in the cold logic of pattern recognition and honed by years of academic study, flagged it instantly. A cluster of 3 pixels on a jagged overhang had shifted against the wind. Rocks, she knew, did not move against the wind. "Crucible Command, this is Specialist Thorne at Station 4, she said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart against her ribs. "I have a visual anomaly on the eastern ridge. Grid coordinate Sierra Delta 904. I'm marking a likely ambush site or pre-staged IED. Requesting Spectre 7 halt immediately." The low roar of activity in the Crucible Command Center suddenly went brittle. The silence that followed was not one of respect, but of incredulity. Commander Rourke slowly swiveled his chair around, his boots scuffing against the floor with a sound like sandpaper on bone. He looked at Kira, then at the massive master screen that displayed the clean signal intelligence reports, the supposed all clear. "Thorne, what are you talking about?" Rourke asked, his tone dripping with a condescending patience that felt like a slap. "We've been scrubbing the local bands for 3 hours. There isn't a single radio transmission, no cellular pings, and the village elders gave us a green light 10 miles back. It's a ghost town out there." His words hung heavy in the air, a public reprimand delivered with surgical precision. "The signals are quiet because they're disciplined, sir," Kira countered, her finger hovering over the screen indicating the anomaly. "Look at the thermal signature on that overhang. It's a heat sink. Someone is using a thermal blanket to mask their position, but the wind just caught a corner of it. There is a human element up there." Rourke stood up, walking over to her station with a heavy, intimidating stride. His shadow fell across her workspace, momentarily blotting out the flickering blue light of her monitor. He stared at the screen for 2 seconds before letting out a sharp, derisive snort that caused the analysts at neighboring desks to chuckle nervously. "You're seeing shadows, Specialist," Rourke said, loud enough for the entire Crucible to hear. "You're so desperate to find a ghost that you're hallucinating 3-pixel insurgents." The humiliation was a physical weight, a cold lump in her stomach. She could hear the whispers starting up again. The librarian is overthinking things, trying to be a hero from behind a desk. Rourke continued, his voice hardening. Spectre 7 is on a tight timeline to reach its extraction point. I am not stopping a Tier 1 element because a rookie is spooked by a rock formation. Kira felt a flush of heat rise to her neck, but she didn't look away from the monitor. "Sir, with respect," she began, her voice unwavering. "The absence of signal is not the absence of threat. If they know we're listening to the airwaves, they'll stop talking. But they can't hide the physics of their own body heat forever." "That's enough, Thorne," Rourke snapped, his patience finally breaking. His face was a mask of rising anger. "You've been corrected. Flagging a false positive on a mission of this scale creates alarm fatigue. If you keep crying wolf, the operators will start ignoring the real threats. Now stay on your sweep and keep your mouth shut unless you see a literal rocket launcher." She watched the lead vehicle of Spectre 7 enter the narrowest part of the gorge, a place where the canyon walls were so steep the operators wouldn't even be able to open their doors if they were pinned down. What would you have done in that moment? Would you have stayed quiet to save your career, knowing that a single insubordinate outburst could lead to a permanent black mark on your record? Or would you have risked a court-martial, standing your ground against a man with 20 years of experience to save lives you've never met and who don't even know your name? For Kira, the choice wasn't about ego or career progression. It was about the memory of a folded flag and the sound of taps playing over a grave that should have been empty for another 50 years. She knew Rourke was right about the signal intelligence. The airwaves were silent. But she also knew that the silence was too perfect. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath. She watched as the third vehicle in the convoy followed the lead into what she now believed was a kill zone. On her screen, the shadow on the ridge moved again, just a fraction of an inch. It was a spotter adjusting his position for a better line of sight. Kira's hands hovered over her keyboard, her mind racing through the regulations. If she bypassed Rourke and went directly to the tactical air controller, she would be violating the chain of command in a way that was almost impossible to come back from. She would be branded as unstable or uncontrollable. But as she looked at the thermal rectangles of the convoy, she didn't see vehicles. She saw 30 men with families, 3 of whom were probably the same age as her brother when he died. The tension in the crucible was escalating, not because of the enemy, but because of the internal friction. Every time Kira adjusted her zoom or tried to re-verify the heat signature, Rourke would clear his throat or make a snide comment to the analyst next to him. They were waiting for her to break, to admit she was wrong, and to go back to being a quiet, compliant part of the machine. "Thorne, I'm serious," Rourke said, his voice dropping to a low, threatening growl. "Log that anomaly as a geological heat sink and move your drone to the secondary objective. We need eyes on the landing zone, not on a pile of rocks." Kira didn't move her cursor. She didn't log the anomaly as a heat sink. Instead, she began a deep scan protocol, a process that used the drone's infrared sensors to map the density of objects. It was a time-consuming process that drew power away from other sensors, a move that would be immediately visible to the system administrators. "I can't do that, sir," Kira said, her voice now a flat, chilling monotone. "I am maintaining observation on the primary threat. If you want me off this station, you'll have to have the MPs remove me. But until then, I am reporting an active ambush in progress." The room went dead silent. This was no longer a disagreement. It was a mutiny. Analysts turned in their seats, their eyes wide as they looked between the young specialist and the veteran lead. Rourke's face turned a deep, mottled red, his fists clenching at his sides. "You're done, Thorne," Rourke whispered, the words vibrating with rage. "Get away from that console, now." Kira didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the screen, watching the thermal signature of the rock begin to separate into two distinct shapes. One was a human head. The other was the long, thin barrel of a weapon. The convoy was 30 seconds from the trigger point. The conflict had reached its breaking point. In the Crucible, the battle was over authority and ego. But 1,000 miles away, in a canyon of shadows and stone, the battle was about to become a matter of blood and survival. "Look at the crevices, Rourke," she said, her voice dropping into a cold, clinical register. "It's 0600 hours. The morning sun is hitting the eastern face of that canyon. At this time of day, the cliff swifts and rock martins should be swarming those ledges for the morning hatch." Rourke paused, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder, his earlier intent to physically remove her momentarily forgotten. He looked at the screen, then back at her, a flicker of genuine confusion replacing his rage. "What are you talking about, Thorne? I don't care about the local wildlife. We're tracking a Tier 1 convoy, not filming a nature documentary." "They aren't there," Kira whispered, ignoring his bite. "The thermal sensors are picking up the ambient heat of the stone, but there is zero movement from the nesting sites. Birds are sensitive to high-frequency vibrations and the smell of propellant. If those ledges were empty, I'd be wrong. But they're not empty. They're abandoned. Something has driven them out of their natural habitat within the last hour." It was a detail so subtle, so deeply rooted in the environmental pattern recognition she had mastered, that it left a momentary vacuum of silence in the Crucible. Despite the looming threat of a reprimand, Kira's fingers danced across her keyboard. She wasn't just watching the feed anymore. She was rewriting the mission parameters. She began manually overwriting the drone's pre-programmed flight path, a move that sent a bright red manual over alert flashing across the master observation board in the center of the room. "Specialist, stand down!" Rourke commanded. But Kira was already banking the multi-million-dollar Spectre drone. "That bird is on a fixed orbit. You're going to lose the satellite handshake if you push that bank angle." "I'm getting a low-angle look," Kira countered, her eyes wide and fixed. "The automated sweep looks top-down, which is exactly what the insurgents want. They've built their hides into the vertical fissures. If I can get the lens to 60 degrees, I can look under the overhangs." The Crucible grew quiet, a heavy, ominous silence. Kira was now in open defiance of a direct order from the lead analyst, risking a strategic asset to prove a theory about birds and shadows. She pushed the aircraft to its aerodynamic limit, the drone screaming through the thin mountain air thousands of feet above the Serpent's coil. The horizon tilted violently on her screen. Kira's screen blurred as the drone struggled to maintain its focus during the aggressive maneuver. The horizon spun violently, the digital image an incoherent mess of shifting thermal gradients. Then, with a shudder that resonated through her very bones, the image stabilized. By dropping the drone's altitude and changing the sensor angle, she had eliminated the top-down bias. She wasn't looking at a flat map anymore. She was looking into the very mouth of the canyon's hidden cave systems, under the overhangs previously invisible to the standard sweep. "There," Kira said, her finger tapping the glass so hard it left a smudge, a tiny mark of human contact on the cold digital world. "Look at the edge of the shadow. The pixel density is too high for natural rock. It's a weave. It's a ghillie net." In the lower quadrant of her screen, hidden beneath a massive granite shelf that the standard sweep had ignored, a series of shapes began to resolve. They weren't goats. They weren't heat blooms from a herder's fire. They were the distinct, cold-edged silhouettes of men, wearing thermal suppression suits, huddled over long, heavy objects that could only be belt-fed machine guns. The tension in the Crucible command center shifted from mockery to a cold, visceral dread. The shadows were real. The ghost town was a graveyard waiting to happen. Kira had found the ambush, but the convoy was now only 3 minutes away from the trigger point, and the radio interference was getting worse. She didn't look at Rourke, didn't look for an apology. She simply zoomed in closer, her hands steady on the controls, her mind already calculating the quickest way to relay the coordinates before the canyon wall swallowed the convoy's signal for good. She was no longer the girl who might trip over her boots. She was the only person on the planet who could see the invisible threads of the trap. The atmosphere in the crucible had shifted from a room of analysts into a room of witnesses. The air felt thinner, the hum of the servers sounding more like a low-frequency warning. Kira didn't care about the politics of the room anymore. She didn't care about the disciplinary report Rourke was likely already drafting in his head. She closed her eyes for a split second, shutting out the glowing monitors and the whispered doubts, reaching back into a memory that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. She remembered her brother, Liam, sitting on the porch during his last leave. He had been tossing pebbles into the shadows of the woods behind their house. He told her that in the desert, the most dangerous things aren't the ones that are hot. It's the things that are too cold. "The enemy knows we have thermal eyes, Kira," he had said, his voice a ghost in her mind. "They use the earth against the machine. They soak wool in well water and hide under it. To a computer, they look like a patch of damp mud. You have to look for the dead spots in the pattern." It was a legacy technique, a piece of soldier craft passed down from the muddy trenches of history, far removed from the high-tech manuals of the modern army. Kira opened her eyes and stopped looking for heat. She started looking for cold. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the drone's automated target acquisition software. She began to manually adjust the gain and level of the infrared sensor, stripping away the vibrant oranges and yellows that represented the sun-soaked rocks. She plunged the screen into a high-contrast grayscale, searching for the black holes in the thermal landscape. "Thorne, what are you doing?" Rourke's voice was lower now, the aggression replaced by a nervous, twitchy energy. "You're washing out the image. You can't see a thing in that contrast." "I'm not looking for them, sir," Kira replied, her voice eerily calm. "I'm looking for where they aren't." She found it, on the western slope, directly opposite the first anomaly. It was a rectangular patch of absolute black, a cold spot that shouldn't have existed. In the middle of a desert morning, where everything was warming at a predictable mathematical rate, this one patch of Earth was dropping in temperature. "They're using wet blankets," Kira said, her eyes tracing the edges of the black rectangle. "Old-school thermal masking. The water evaporates and cools the fabric, creating a barrier that our sensors usually interpret as a shadow or a mineral deposit. But look at the geometry. Nature doesn't make perfect 90-degree angles with moisture." The room was now so quiet you could hear the frantic clicking of Kira's mouse. She was no longer just an analyst. She was a hunter. She used the drone's laser rangefinder to ping the area around the cold spot. Not a direct hit, which might alert an enemy with a laser warning receiver, but a near miss to measure the distance between the suspicious patch and the canyon floor. "If that's just a shadow," Kira whispered, "the depth sensor should read 30 feet to the canyon wall. But if it's a physical object..." The data flashed on her sub-monitor. 8 feet. There was something solid suspended in midair, masked by a thermal shroud, positioned perfectly to overlook the exact point where Spectre 7 would be forced to slow down to navigate a rockfall. Rourke leaned in so close to Kira's screen that she could hear the raspy sound of his breathing. The arrogance had drained from his face, leaving behind the pale, weathered mask of a man who realized he had almost walked his brothers into a slaughter. He wasn't looking at the librarian anymore. He was looking at a specialist who had just outthought the most sophisticated surveillance suite in the world. "Wait," Rourke muttered, his finger hovering near the screen. Zoom in on the left flank of that cold spot. Enhance the edge detection. Kira obeyed. She ran a Laplacian filter over the area, sharpening the boundaries between light and dark. The rock at the edge of the blanket didn't just move, it breathed. As the drone's angle shifted by a fraction of a degree, the sun caught a sliver of glass, the unmistakable glint of a high-powered optic. Then the rock stood up. It was a slow, agonizingly deliberate movement. A figure draped in a heavy, ragged ghillie suit woven from the very brush and dust of the canyon rose from a prone position. The figure adjusted the wet wool blanket, tucking it tighter around a second man who was braced behind a heavy DSK machine gun. They were so well camouflaged that even with the enhancement, they looked like a ripple in the stone. "Spotter," Rourke breathed, the word barely a ghost of a sound. "They've got a command detonation team up there. They aren't talking on the radio because they don't have to. They're using visual signals." Kira felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the crucible. She had found the dead spot. She had seen through the wet blankets and the ghillie suits, but as she looked at the master clock, her blood ran cold. 2 minutes to the kill box, the navigation officer announced. His voice was no longer tight. It was trembling. "Spectre 7 is entering the primary engagement zone. Comms are at 10% and dropping. We can't get a clear voice channel through, Rourke." The shift in the room was total. The mockery was gone, replaced by a frantic, high-stakes energy. The men who had laughed at Kira were now looking to her as if she held the keys to life and death. Rourke's hand, which had once reached to dismiss her, now rested on the back of her chair, a silent acknowledgement of her authority in this moment. Comms with Spectre 7 were now at 10% and dropping, with only 2 minutes left until they reached the trigger point. The mineral-rich walls of the Serpent's Coil Canyon were acting like a natural Faraday cage, swallowing the signals before they could reach the convoy's antennas. With voice comms effectively useless, Kira Thorne knew she had to improvise a non-verbal warning. Her surveillance drone, the Spectre bird, was a platform for observation, not a strike asset. No Hellfire missiles to send a fiery message, no way to talk to them. But it had secondary systems, meant not for communication, but for marking targets for others. "I'm going to use the IR pointer," Kira said, her voice filled with a sudden, desperate resolve. It sliced through the frantic whispers and the low hum of the crucible. "If I can paint the lead vehicle's windshield with the infrared laser, their night vision goggles will pick it up as a strobe. It'll be like a flare going off in the driver's lap." Rourke's breath hitched. He knew the protocols intimately. "It's against protocol to use the designator that close to friendly glass," he warned, but there was no conviction in his voice, only the ghost of a question. "You could temporarily blind the driver." "Better blind than dead, sir," Kira replied, her gaze unbreaking from the screen. She took the manual flight stick, her movements fluid and precise. She wasn't the girl who tripped over her boots. She was the pilot of a ghost, a guardian angel made of aluminum and silicon. She banked the drone into a steep, dangerous dive, bringing the nose down until the laser designator was lined up with the lead armored ground mobility vehicle. She watched the kill box on her screen, a narrow stretch of road flanked by the hidden machine gun nests she had uncovered. The convoy was mere seconds away. The insurgents were tensing, their fingers likely hovering over the triggers of their weapons and the blasting caps of the IEDs. "Engaging laser," Kira said. In the crucible, a small green light began to blink on her console. 1,000 miles away, a silent, invisible beam of light shot out from the drone's nose, striking the reinforced glass of the lead vehicle. To the naked eye, nothing happened, but to the driver of Spectre 7-1, peering through his PVS-4 goggles, the world was suddenly filled with a rhythmic, pulsing light that screamed one thing: Stop. The lead vehicle's brake lights flared, a brilliant, sudden red on the thermal feed. The convoy ground to a halt 50 yards short of the first cold spot. The trap had been sprung, but the prey had stopped at the edge of the jaws. The Crucible command center was frozen. 30 people held their breath as they watched the thermal rectangles sit motionless in the heart of the canyon. Kira's hands were still on the controls, her heart thundering against her ribs. She had broken every rule in the book, and in doing so, she had just rewritten the fate of 30 men. In the chaos of war, when all conventional methods fail, what desperate, rule-breaking risks would you take to save lives you've never met? Kira hadn't just bent the rules, she had shattered them, guided by a fierce instinct and the echoes of a personal tragedy. The air in the Crucible, thick with ozone and the metallic tang of adrenaline, felt heavy with the weight of her defiance. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, no longer with disdain, but with a raw, desperate hope. The heavy double doors of the Crucible swung open with a violent thud, and the room's air seemed to vanish. Colonel Holloway, the brigade commander, stormed in with his senior staff, his face a mask of controlled fury. The comms blackout had reached the top floor, and the dead air from Spectre 7 was screaming louder than any siren. "Why is my lead element stationary in the middle of a canyon?" Holloway's voice boomed, vibrating the glass partitions. "Rourke, I've got 30 men in a dark hole and no radio contact. Tell me we have eyes on the ground." Rourke, usually the first to bark back, didn't speak. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. He simply stepped aside, clearing the path to Kira's station. He didn't point. He simply looked at Kira with a silent, heavy nod of permission. It was a gesture that spoke volumes, an admission of defeat, and a transference of authority in a single, desperate moment. The colonel marched over, his shadow looming over the young specialist, a dark, imposing figure in the flickering blue light. But Kira didn't flinch. She kept the laser strobe active with one hand and adjusted the digital zoom with the other, her movements precise, unhurried. Her focus remained absolute. "Sir," Kira said, her voice a calm anchor in the storm of the colonel's arrival. "Convoy is halted at my command. I flagged a multi-threat ambush. If they move another 50 meters, they enter a synchronized kill zone." Holloway leaned over the desk, his eyes narrowing as he took in the grayscale image. On Kira's screen, the invisible enemy was now fully exposed. She had used the drone's digital overlay to map the entire site. 12 distinct red markers for shooters, 2 blue boxes for RPK machine gun nests, and a pulsing yellow triangle over the cold spot where the command-detonated mine lay buried. The colonel went deathly still. He wasn't looking at a grainy feed anymore. He was looking at a masterpiece of intelligence. He saw the wet blankets, the ghillie suits, and the tactical positioning. He realized that the insurgents weren't just waiting. They had been perfectly positioned to pin the convoy from 3 sides, leaving only one narrow path for a retreat. "They left an exit route," the colonel whispered, his finger tracing a small opening toward the western ridge. "No, sir," Kira corrected softly, her voice still quiet but firm. "That's a funnel. If they retreated that way, they'd be channeled into a secondary minefield. I've been tracking the soil displacement there for 40 minutes. It's a dead end." Holloway straightened his back, his eyes moving from the screen to the name tape on Kira's chest. "Thorne." He looked at the senior analysts who were now standing in a semicircle of shamed silence. He realized that this desk jockey hadn't just found an ambush. She had mapped the enemy's entire playbook, while the veterans were busy looking at empty radio waves. The colonel's posture shifted from frantic command to a sudden, profound respect. He looked at the young woman who had defied protocol and endured mockery to save his men. The crucible fell into a silence so deep you could hear the soft whir of the drone's cooling fans on Kira's console. Colonel Holloway, a mask of controlled fury, now loomed over her station, demanding an explanation for the halted convoy. "Specialist," Holloway said, his voice now a low, resonant growl, tinged with awe. "You didn't just find them. You dismantled them." The digital clock on the wall felt like it was stuttering, the seconds stretching into infinities as the crucible watched the screen in breathless anticipation. On the thermal feed, the lead vehicle of Spectre 7 remained frozen, its tires inches away from the invisible line that would have triggered the end of 30 lives. The strobe Kira had projected onto their glass had worked. The operators had sensed the invisible hand of a guardian reaching down from the stratosphere. Through the static of the degraded comms, a single crackling burst of audio finally punched through the mineral interference. It wasn't a voice, it was the rhythmic click of a handset. 3 short pulses. It was the danger close signal for an unconfirmed threat. They were blind, but they were listening. "Target data is uploaded to the tactical net, sir," Kira said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it filled the room. "The coordinates for the suppressive blanket and the RPK nests are live. If they fire now, they have the high ground advantage." Colonel Holloway didn't hesitate. He grabbed the master radial handset, bypassing the relay. "Spectre 7, he barked, his voice cutting through the static. "This is Overlord. You're being lased. Trust the light. Execute fire mission on designated markers. Break. Burn them out." The response was instantaneous. On Kira's monitor, the 5 white rectangles of the convoy erupted into a synchronized display of violence. The turret-mounted machine guns didn't sweep the road. They aimed upward, pouring concentrated heavy fire into the exact cold spots Kira had mapped. Tracers, appearing as streaks of white-hot lightning on the infrared, tore into the ghillie nets and the wet blankets. The ambushers, caught in the very trap they had set, had nowhere to go. One by one, the red markers on Kira's screen, the shooters she had hunted through the pixels, flickered and vanished. The main mine, the cold spot, hit by a stray .50 caliber round, erupted in a massive bloom of heat that washed out the sensor for a split second. When the image cleared, the path was open. The crucible should have erupted in cheers. In the movies, this was the moment of high fives and triumphant shouting. But in the stark reality of the Serpent's Coil Operations Center, there was only a heavy, hollow silence. It was the silence of 30 men and women who had just stared into the abyss and realized it was only a 23-year-old girl who had pulled them back from the edge. The breathing in the room was rhythmic and heavy. The air, still smelling of ozone and burnt coffee, felt charged with a sudden, overwhelming humility. The analysts who had whispered about the librarian didn't look at each other. They looked at their own hands, or the floor, or the ceiling. They were processing the fact that their collective experience and their gut feelings had almost led to 30 caskets. Kira didn't join in the relief. She was already retasking the drone, her hands moving with the same mechanical precision she had shown since the start of her shift. She was scanning the ridge lines for secondary threats, her eyes still hunting, still protecting. She didn't look up when she heard the heavy scuff of boots approaching her station. It was Commander Rourke, the lead analyst, the man who had laughed, the man who had tried to wave her away like a nuisance, stood beside her desk. His face was no longer mottled with rage. It was pale, his eyes reflecting the blue glow of her screen with a newfound clarity. He didn't offer a hollow apology. He didn't try to explain himself. With a slow, deliberate movement, Rourke reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, bronze-edged challenge coin. It was a commander's coin, a rare token of excellence earned during a bloody tour in the Helmand province, a piece of his own history he held dearer than his rank. He leaned over and placed the coin on the corner of Kira's desk, right next to the microfiber cloth she used to clean her screen. There was a sharp, metallic clink as the bronze hit the laminate. It was the loudest sound Kira had ever heard. Rourke didn't say a word. He simply placed a heavy hand on her shoulder for a brief second, a gesture of brotherhood that transcended rank and age. Then he turned and walked back to his station. The message was clear. She wasn't a pog. She wasn't a desk jockey. She was one of them. Kira looked down at the coin. In the center was an eagle with its wings spread, and around the border were the words, "Vigilance is the price of freedom." She took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the cold metal before looking back at the screen. Spectre 7 was moving again, clearing the canyon and heading for the open desert. They were safe, and for the first time in years, the ghost of her brother felt a little further away. As the dust settled in the Serpent's Coil Canyon and the thermal signatures of the Spectre 7 vehicles safely reached the open plateau, the high-octane energy of the Crucible Command Center began to simmer down. The colonel and his staff retreated to the command room to begin the official debrief, leaving the floor to the analysts. There was an unspoken expectation that Kira would stand up, take a bow, or perhaps finally unleash the frustration she had been holding back. But Kira Thorne did neither. She simply picked up her microfiber cloth. With a steady hand, she wiped away the smudge she had left on the glass when she pointed out the ambush. She checked the drone's fuel levels, updated the sensor calibration, and began a fresh sweep of the secondary objective. To Kira, the mission wasn't a moment of personal glory. It was a shift that wasn't over yet. She didn't want a medal or a ceremony. She just wanted to make sure that for the next 8 hours, every man under her watch made it to the next coordinate. The other analysts watched her out of the corners of their eyes. The room was different now. The banter was quieter, more respectful. They realized that they were sitting in the presence of a silent watcher, the kind of soldier who doesn't wear a tab or a badge, but who carries the weight of 1,000 lives in the focus of her eyes. What quiet acts of defiance, driven by integrity and the lessons of the past, reshape the course of history and redefine true heroism? Kira Thorne, the quiet specialist, understood that the desert doesn't lie, even when the airwaves are silent. She had honored her brother's memory, not with tears, but with a level of vigilance that ensured no other family would have to endure the same silence he left behind. As the sun began to rise over the base, casting long shadows across the tarmac, Kira finally allowed herself a small, private smile. She looked at the challenge coin resting on her desk, its bronze surface catching the dim light of the monitors, then back at her screen, a silent sentinel in the dim glow, forever committed to seeing the invisible.